Welcome to Educational Alpha. I'm Bill Kelly, CEO of CAIA Association, and your host, bringing you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, and industry colleagues from around the globe. Educational Alpha is sponsored by iCapital, the financial technology company with the mission to power the world's alternative investment marketplace. Part innovator, part educator, and part navigator of the alternatives industry, iCapital offers intuitive, scalable digital solutions that have transformed how private market and hedge fund investments are bought and sold. With iCapital, financial advisors, wealth managers, and asset managers around the world now have access to everything they need to deliver the return and diversification potential of alternatives to high net worth investors. To learn more, visit iCapital.com.
In this episode, Bill sits down with Tim Hodgson, co-founder of the Thinking Ahead Institute, to discuss the transformative journey of the investment industry. Starting from Tim's early career as an institutional investment consultant to the inception of the Thinking Ahead Institute in 2015, they explore the evolution from a business-centric to a more purpose-driven approach. They talk about the collaboration between asset owners and managers, the pursuit of professionalism in the industry, and the intricate dynamics of private and public market investments. They also address global pension systems, demographic shifts, and the ethical considerations vital for sustaining trust and transparency in the investment landscape. Listen in.
Tim Hodgson, welcome to Educational Alpha.
Bill, thanks for having me.
I was looking forward to this conversation. We've done a lot with Thinking Ahead Institute over the years, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the origins of TAI and our relationship in a moment. But sticking to the script, so to speak, maybe Tim, first off, a little bit on your background and what led you to TAI.
I was an institutional investment consultant, but I had a passion for research, and I had a wonderful colleague in Roger Irwin who encouraged that. But I ended up taking a sabbatical, and halfway through made the mistake of having dinner with Roger and told him everything that was wrong with my job. And he just looked at me slightly confused and went, "But I can change every one of those factors." So I came back without clients, part-time, on a roving research brief, and excelled. So a year later, we formalized the creation of the Thinking Ahead Group in June 2002. And effectively, we were a small research and development team within WTW's investment business. Roll the clock forward. At some stage, Roger handed over leading of the team to me. Best job I ever had, but after a while, it became slightly fine. We don't know anything about this, but it's a bit rinse and repeat. So I set a challenge of trying to have more purpose. And that was really the birth of the Thinking Ahead Institute. Could we bring asset owners and asset managers into the research and development to try and have more impact? And so we set up the Thinking Ahead Institute in January 2015.
Appreciate the background. I, too, am a big Roger fan. He's a bit of a lord and an elder statesman in this space. And he has an infectious way with devoid of ego of pulling people in. So I can definitely relate to what you've said there. And he's constantly giving back. And I should disclose the relationship, and we can talk more about that with Thinking Ahead Institute and WTW. And Jane Bach, who's with WTW in APAC, I was with her just last week in Los Angeles on this total portfolio approach paper we put out, and Jane was a significant contributor there, but she's got a big remit heading up investments in Asia for WTW and sits on the CAIA board. And maybe just you and Roger giving back is how she rolls. So maybe that's in the DNA of you folks, which is great. So a lot to cover here, and maybe starting with perhaps a little bit of self-interest, and this can maybe lead us down some of the work that you do at Thinking Ahead Institute. But we've done a lot in collaboration with you folks. And I think before I knew you, before I even really knew Roger, John Bowman has had a long history with Roger over the years. But I did look at some of your research, and I think maybe Thinking Ahead was earlier than most on the concept of capital formation in the private markets. And there's a paper you had put out on that very subject. A lot of people are now focusing on this, but the length of companies staying private now versus maybe 10 years ago. And if you look at the amount of capital they needed to raise in an IPO, it used to be everything to them, and now it's maybe close to nothing. So I was a fan of your research before we did more together. But fast forward to recent vintage, i.e. maybe the first few months of this year, we culminated a discussion that maybe began perhaps close to a year ago, where we approached you folks to say, we're thinking about disruption with a capital D, and it affects everything, not the least of which is, what is the role of an ethically grounded professional in this space? And maybe at the core, nothing's changed because it is client first. But we were looking at the business practices that the CFA kindly allowed us to adopt, and that was how we rolled. But we were looking for something that was a little bit more asset owner focused and maybe got a little bit more granular. And we did release what is now the principles that are behind this redefining professional best practices to our members. And we're awaiting feedback. And it might be helpful, I'll just quickly, in a very summary fashion, tick these off if I can read my chicken scratch here. And there's nothing that should surprise any listener on this, but embracing ethical behavior, aligning with the client, putting that client first, emphasizing transparency, which I think has been left wanting between LP and GP, and we could talk more about that. Establishing the highest standards of practice, prioritize professionalism, commit to continuous learning. And I think that's important because the pace of change is moving so very rapidly. And then lastly, fostering collaboration within your organization, profession, and community. And I think that's an important one too, because I and maybe you have seen a lot of leaders that get it and understand the importance of ethically based principles. But the culture, if it's one person dependent, it is not seeped into the institution itself, then it doesn't land so well. You and your team were instrumental in helping us think through this. And I'll just take a pause there and get some of your reactions about your approach to this, the level of import that you put into it, and what our expectations should be as we go down this newish path.
Maybe the first thing I'd like to say is a big thank you to CAIA, and that includes you and John and Steve, and for thinking that we could maybe have something to say, for trusting us with partnering you on this thinking journey, because it's not something that anybody can claim ownership over. And we try in the Thinking Ahead Institute to remain as humble as we can. And this relates to one of the things you read out, the continuous learning. We try and stay eternally curious. What don't we understand? What don't we know? And therefore, the process itself was wonderful in terms of conversations with you, comments on drafts, even being able to listen in to a working group of charter holders discuss a draft, all gave us really good feedback. So a big thanks. It's something that is dear to our hearts because we are probably above all would like to think of ourselves as systems thinkers. So there's almost no end to where your thinking starts and finishes if you put yourself out as a system thinker. But obviously the behavior of components of a system then really matters because behaviors transmit through a system. They transmit messages or actions, and resources get allocated on the back of that. So if I can perhaps go back to the origin story of the Thinking Ahead Institute, when I decided that I wanted a big, purposeful goal, I looked at the investment industry. I went, do you know what? In my career to date, which was probably at least 25 years by that point, I believed I'd watched investment in general morph from a profession to a business, and actually a very successful business with high wages and high profit margins, which is fine if you have sophisticated adult buyers of your services. And you've mentioned Australian super funds, and some of the big asset owners of the world are very intelligent, sophisticated buyers. But actually, we were coming from an environment of big corporate defined benefit plans where an individual basically didn't have to think about their retirement or the risk of outliving their savings or anything like that. It was all provided for, but DB was clearly on the way out, and DC, defined contribution, was in the way in, where the financial risk falls on the shoulders of the end saver. And I was worried that without a committed intermediary acting on behalf of the end saver, that the balance between seller of investment services and uninitiated buyer of investment services could be a recipe for a bad consumer outcome, let's say. And therefore, the idea of professionalism is very dear to our heart. To what standards are we going to hold ourselves? To what extent are we going to think about a longer horizon, more stakeholders than simply profit maximization in the short term, if I can use that as a contrasting point? You got us on one of our points of passion, and it was a pleasure working with you on the material.
So many fat pitches there. I'm not sure which one to swing at, but maybe I'm going to first go back to something you said and go back 232 years. And you had said we've gone from a profession to an industry. And I don't know if I'm fully on the same page. And I've had this discussion with John Bowman as well. I don't think we ever were a profession, and I don't know if we ever will be a profession. And it's because of the length of time. So 232 years ago, despite our appearances, and the camera's not on, but we were not born back then. The CFA and CAIA did not exist, but there was a buttonwood tree on Wall Street and a buttonwood agreement. And 24, and at that point, and maybe still an issue for us today, 24 white men got together and they created some founding principles that might have defined the specialist role. And it was wrapped in collusion. It was price setting and nobody else can come in. And so I think we started out maybe on the wrong foot, where it was all about the people creating the agreement and less about the client. And I think our challenge, and this is why it's a challenge, but maybe a mandate as well, is we're trying to retroactively professionalize an industry that goes back at least 230 years. And I think the Dutch were at this maybe even earlier on. So there's a very, very important mandate. And you can comment on where we are in professionalism in a moment, but maybe something else that you mentioned. And this is going to sound very basic, but I think this is how we have to think about it. Without the client, we have nothing. There's nothing to manage, nothing to invest, nothing to return. And hopefully when we do return it, it's in better shape than we got it in the first place, because that client has expectations of us. So the mandate we have is so very important. And as we get toward democratization, the manager may not know the end client and probably does not know the end client. If it's the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority or the Yale Endowment or Harvard Management, for sure they know the CIO. And if they don't do right by them, they're going to be in a world of hurt and they get fired. If somebody's managing a mutual fund for you and I, we might know their name. They have no idea who we are. So I think the connective tissue of feeling very, very responsible for the end client is broken because of the so many legs in the system as you go from investor to the person managing the money. So a lot there, and maybe this is why we got together in the first place, because professionalism and at least codify some rules of engagement are now maybe more important than ever.
Again, Bill, a lot in what you said to respond to. I like what you say. I pretty much agree with all you say. The slight context difference that I might make between us is, while I am not an actuary, I've now worked for many, many years in a very large employer of actuaries, and there is an actuarial profession. We could argue precisely how it as a profession compares to the profession of lawyers or whatever. But I suppose I was close enough to see that and infer that that had an influence on institutional investment. I agree that not many of the asset managers were ever not businesses in a sense, but more of them were probably partnerships or employee owned if we went enough decades back. We're then probably in a tussle between the descriptive and the normative. So describing the reality, which you have laid out clearly, and what I describe as the normative, or how it should be, but isn't. And so what I think was very interesting to explore in the work that we did together on professionalism was, is there any advantage? Is there any enlightened self-interest? Is there any desire for actors within the investment value chain to self-declare as professionals, or to willingly and voluntarily tie themselves to a set of principles that they needn't tie themselves to? We tried to articulate in the pieces that we wrote that there were reasons for doing so. A business, we would argue, is very transactional. Now, a business can have a purpose, it can act with integrity, it can have its own culture and standards of ethics, or a business can be quite cynical. So there is a wide spread of behaviors available to a business. But at the end of the day, I would argue that businesses are fundamentally transactional. Investment, for most buyers of investment services, needs to be relational, because the transaction and its consequences are felt over long periods of time. There is not a good or service that is consumed immediately. There are consequences that flow from the building or the maintenance of a particular portfolio, the meeting or not of particular investment goals. So the other point that we built in was the notion of trust, and we made quite a big deal of trust. I think there is an advantage to investment organizations in demonstrating their trustworthiness if they voluntarily submit to live by a set of principles for the greater good that enables their client to trust them. Now, this isn't in and of itself me creating a magical, fluffy world. This is monetizable slowly over time. This is a competitive advantage that is reapable over time, we believe. So that was certainly the case that we tried to make. And so while I don't disagree with your analysis of collusion, self-serving, whatever, I think we can equally apply a slightly different lens to get a more nuanced picture of history and shared reality.
I think we're more in agreement than not on that point, Tim. And you said the personal nature of this relationship. And even in this course of the conversation, if I say something that offends you, I feel very badly about that. But if a bunch of actuaries write to me as a result of this podcast, and I do believe it's a profession, so they don't have to worry about that. But if they come at me, I'm not going to feel as bad because I don't know them. That relationship is so critically important. But the reality that as we think about democratization and going from a defined benefit scheme to a defined contribution scheme, the reality that the manager is going to know the constituents, the ultimate investors for whom they serve, is going to be less and less true. They very well would know the big institution and the decision makers, because the chain from asset owner to investing is very tight, but less so as you get into democratization. And I think this is why your purpose and our purpose and the purpose we built together around these professional best practices are so critically important. And I start any day or any organization I talk to with a fair amount of trust. I'll see that, but then I've got to figure out, are they worthy of that trust in the first place? But I think one of the challenges we have is, I don't know, in your market in the UK, the legal or regulatory definition of a fiduciary, but I imagine it's probably not too dissimilar to how the SEC defines it. But it is very broad, and there's a lot of gray space to move around in. And I think what we're trying to say to the professional is, don't go to the edge. Try to put that client first. And if you can't, and there's sometimes you're not going to be able to, because if I'm a GP, I have shareholders, I have partners, and I have a responsibility to them as well. And Jack Bogle, somebody who I know TAI and CAIA has a lot of respect for some of the principles he brought forward, he says you can't serve two masters if you're a general partner and asset manager. Now, I think that you can disclose what those conflicts are, and we should disclose. But I think if we had a much more prescriptive definition and a tight definition of a fiduciary, maybe you and I could go to the beach half the day and not worry about it. But we don't. And I think therein lies the challenge and maybe the opportunity for a true profession.
I'd argue that's why the principles are worded as they are. So you read them out, but let me pick on transparency and account, sunlight being the best disinfectant. So it may not be possible to serve two masters, but you can be transparent to both. In being transparent, you have an attempt to retain trust. No, I have to do the following, and I'm telling you why I'm going to do the following. And I know this is not your first choice, but I hope that I get some credit for being transparent with you on the basis that over the course of a long-term relationship, maybe next time I'm further up the pecking order, but transparently so.
Maybe a real live example, Tim, you can react to. So I speak a lot publicly. I just got off from 5 or 6 weeks on the road and did probably over 24 panel discussions. And I love my job because I get to talk to a lot of very smart people. And you used the word curious before. I may not be a lot of things, but I am very curious, and allows me to ask that follow-up question and try to have a deeper level of understanding. If I do my job right, every single day I'm trying to bridge that gap a little bit more between transparency. But look at the private markets right now and coming out of 2022 and good, better, and different reasons, this denominator effect. And CAIA is now talking about total portfolio approach, which may be the solution there, but that's maybe aside from the conversation. But these LPs want to need more liquidity. And they're sitting there with all this uncalled dry powder. So it's water everywhere and not a drop to drink because that's been spoken for. In many cases, the GP is coming back with fund X+1, so looking for more commitment. And then when I want my capital returned, those returns of capital are coming via financial engineering as opposed to good old-fashioned economics, GP continuation funds, NAV-based lending. And maybe the LPs as a body, maybe through ILPA, but maybe less so, they're not actively out there talking about how they feel. But if you talk to them one-on-one or get them on a stage and get the conversation wrapped in the right discussion, they're not very happy about this. Now, you can't change capital markets. We are where we are. But I think we could do a better job between LP and GP about putting yourself in the shoes of the other person and being maybe a bit more understanding about some of the challenges and opportunities they face, and look at all this uncalled dry powder. And I think I could build the case both ways. It might be a very interesting time to invest, but maybe not so much too, because that clock is ticking. A lot of that dry powder may be 2 or 3 years old. And in order to get a fee on it or continued fee, I got to get it in the ground. And that may or may not be the right opportunity. So I don't know if that's a question or an observation, but I think it gets back to the point you made about transparency. And there's nothing wrong with what the GPs are doing. There's nothing wrong with how the LPs might be feeling, but could we be more transparent? And maybe that's a good example to maybe draft off a little bit.
I think it is, and it triggers a thought. So I'm pretty sure earlier on in our conversation today, I threw out the term ecosystem. And so understanding this part of the investment industry in the context of the wider investment industry. We had a meeting recently with a lot of the world's largest asset owners in the room. And there were representatives from Canada who have had a particular approach to private markets. And the issue amongst the very big asset owners is their thoughts are definitely turning to replicating the Canadian model and insourcing a lot more of private markets. That doesn't really speak at all to your dry powder point, but it does, I think, speak to the relationship between GP and LP point, and how I think both would be better off with greater transparency, because if the large LPs don't think that the relationship is going the way that's advantageous for them, they do have the option of attempting to build an internal deal sourcing, management, execution staff internally. I would expect to see a bit more insourcing, which then you go round the system loops again. And does that motivate GPs to be more transparent or less transparent? Do they see a competitive advantage in a different sector of the LP universe? And your head starts to hurt after a while.
And not all LP are created equal. And you mentioned the Canadian plans, that Maple model. Oftentimes they are exceedingly well funded, in some cases working with surpluses, and they've been at this a long, long time. And they have direct access to deal flow. They can make direct investments. But then if you get into the public pension plan space in the US, it's a little bit more challenged, and they're running with much smaller staffs. They're not as well funded. And I think as much as they know what they need to do or can do, they just don't have the resource to do it themselves. And this is both good and bad. They're very dependent upon the system, and they're very dependent upon the GP. And I think that is a very important mandate that GP takes on. And I think being able to at least put themselves in the shoes of that CIO and understand the challenges she or he is facing, and try to be as responsive as you possibly can, and really understand their liquidity needs too. And maybe we can drift into this a little bit about the recent study that you did on the global pension system, and Larry Fink's letter covers this as well too. But the demographics around the world, for the most part, maybe exceptions of India and Nigeria, they're not in a very good place. We have more and more retirees coming onto the scene than we have new workers. I'm not sure what this gig-based economy really means anymore. Immigration standards are not necessarily friendly to bringing people into many countries. And so there are a lot of challenges, but the aging demographics for somebody running a public pension plan require more cash sooner as they look at the payment of pensioners in the back end. So then maybe their time horizon for investing is not as long as it once was.
Completely, yes. So there's a huge amount that could be said, and you must keep me on track in case I veer off in unwanted directions. You are completely correct. Amongst most developed markets, demographics are really quite scary, as in it's all about aging. Sub-Saharan Africa is where populations are expected to grow. I could do an aside into potential climate change, because who's going to be hit pretty hard by climate change? Well, Sub-Saharan Africa, probably. But this impact of demographic change, I'm not sure has been factored in enough. So I think I saw one article in the Financial Times probably about 15 months ago speculating that half of OECD sovereign debt could be below investment grade by 2060. It is pretty much baked in that public sector finances are going to be under challenge. That puts pressure on Pillar 1, state-provided pensions. The Thinking Ahead Institute had a defined contribution working group back in 2017, and we identified back then that we expected over decades for Pillar 1 pensions to suffer what we called soft default. Soft default would be doesn't rise with inflation. A degradation of the value of the Pillar 1 pension in real terms, even though it may hold its head above water in dollar terms. You've mentioned the funding of public sector pension plans. That's Pillar 2. That's kind of workplace-based pension, but where the state is on the hook for contributions. Well, that's yet another pressure on public finances. And we have the rise of AI and robotics. So what impact do we think that's going to have on employment? So the quantity of jobs, the quality of jobs, the pay grade of those jobs. And I'm not doom and gloom, but I would say the balance of the articles that I'm reading about AI and jobs is towards the negative side. While there are complementarities, and most technologies have a degree of complementarity, and some jobs could become even more valuable, it appears to be that there is a threat, at least, to employment numbers. The same would apply if we believe in automation, so more robots. I've mentioned climate change. Climate change presumably will be a stress on budgets. And by budgets, I mean state public sector budgets, but also potentially on household budgets. I think it's interesting to think of climate change probably as the mother of all correlated risks. So weather gets worse everywhere. And so insurance is based on the idea of uncorrelated risk. So you can offer a low premium and provide high protection because not all risks manifest at the same time. Well, how much private sector insurance for residential property is available in Florida? How much private sector insurance for residential property is available in California relative to 5 years ago? I think we should expect to see a retreat of insurance cover. Insurers won't go bust. They'll just stop writing unprofitable policies. And therefore, households will be forced into effectively self-insuring against extreme weather. If your roof gets ripped off by a storm and you have to pay for a re-roofing, you're not going to be consuming much for the following year or two, assuming your job hasn't been replaced by AI. So forgive me, Bill, I'm really not trying to build a doom-mongering picture. There are a number of strands in play here where, taking a systems thinking point of view, you've got to go, are we, as an investment industry, framing our risk thinking wide enough, long enough in time, and savvy enough to potential systemic risks? So there you go. You set me off on a course. I hope it was an appropriate response.
Those are very good points to bring up, Tim. And I think, well, a couple of things. One is, if anybody is listening or cares enough and says, well, this is somebody else's problem and I hope they figure it out, we all collectively have ownership in this. It's all in our left tail. How wide it is, we can debate that. But a couple of things you said, this whole energy transition, nobody wants to own scope 3 emissions. That's where all the damage is being done. And it's you and I that's that last mile. Decisions we're making today are either putting more scope 3 greenhouse gases in the environment or taking it out. And I think most of us don't even think about it. And if you look at any of these measurement tools from the FCA, SEC, this convergence standards in the private markets, scope 3 is optional. Nobody's measuring scope 3 emissions. And then your point about, I forget exactly how you put it, but we as homeowners, we're the lenders of last resort if these pension plans go bust, because we are the taxpayers and we're going to be on the hook for this. And this relatively, well, it's one of the largest cities, maybe top 20 cities in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Newton, where I live. I had just, through folly and then smart enough to walk away, I was thinking about trying to get involved more in some of the town politics and financing. When I heard the number of unfunded medical liabilities, unfunded, pay-as-you-go system for the city of Newton, I think it was over $100 million. And I went home and I should have done it. I said to my wife, Liz, let's get this house in the market because this is going to be an explosion that's eventually going to take place.
Maybe you need to do the analysis of everywhere that you could potentially move to and see if it's any better.
Well, maybe I rent or live in the back of a Chevy. But I think it underscores the point that all of us have a dog in this fight, and we do have to recognize that. So maybe we're coming up on the end of time, and I would love to have you back, and we can continue this conversation even off air, Tim. But I do want to spend a couple minutes on this global pension study that Thinking Ahead did, and maybe some correlations. And you and I both spoke before we hit the record button a little bit about Larry Fink's letter that's moved away from ESG this year, and he's focused on retirement. And I think what little I read from Fink's letter and what little I know about your pension study, I think there's a lot of alignments about thinking about outcome-based products and thinking about longevity risk. And quickly skimming Fink's letter, I think he talked about if you were born in 1952, which is the year, retiring in 52, which is the year Fink was born, you had a defined benefit plan. Social Security in the US was flush, and you may have lived another 5 to 7 years. But people are living longer, they're getting healthier. And I guess on the one hand, that's good news. The other hand is we have to make sure that they have the financial viability, wherewithal, knowledge to think about how they're going to fund those golden years. Because again, if they fail to invest as individuals, I would like to think polite society is not going to force them out on the street. So the lender of last resort is the ultimate taxpayer. So again, we're all in this together. So maybe some general thoughts about, maybe you haven't read Fink's letter concisely either, but what you're looking to accomplish, maybe some takeaways in this global pension study.
Yeah, there's lots of angles there, Bill. So I've forgotten the precise details, but the first state pension was introduced by Bismarck in Germany, and it paid out if you reach 60 years old. And that was when I think life expectancy was below 50. So essentially, the state said, we will pick up the right-hand tail of longevity. And the state, or more accurately, as you've put it, the taxpayers, ultimately own the right-hand tail of longevity. It seems sensible to manage the societal compact, the deal with your citizenship, that we will look after you well when you are no longer able to look after yourself. And what would the equivalent be now? A state pension that starts at 85, 90, pick a number, but look at the trouble that Macron is having in France to raise retirement ages in France from 60 to 62 or whatever it is. So the social compact is a very important part of the process, and that's above most of our pay grades. So within the Thinking Ahead Institute, we are passionate about the pension system. It's in our lifeblood. We have historical work in the defined contribution working group that I mentioned earlier, where we would make strong statements that a pension system that does not get the beneficiary to the grave with dignity is not fit for purpose. So in other words, we who have indoor work with no heavy lifting, as I think Barton Biggs labeled investment work. So we are privileged, we have indoor work with no heavy lifting, and we're well paid for it. I think we have a duty of care. And this comes back to our professionalism conversation. What do we owe society? What do we owe these people who don't have our privileges? And I think we owe them fit for purpose products. There are one or two good ideas, and we have a future of pensions paper which lists a number of case studies. And actually, in that, we argue quite strongly that the future should be hybrid. We accept that defined benefit probably puts too much financial risk on a single sponsor, but we would also argue that defined contribution puts too much financial risk on the shoulders of people who are not trained or educated to bear it. And therefore, we are passionate advocates of a hybrid structure, which can be designed in a whole number of ways. And actually, the whole Dutch pension system is going through a transition to a hybrid collective defined contribution arrangement. So it's possible at a micro level, it's possible at a country level. But I suppose that's a long-winded way of me being in violent agreement with you. There's a lot going on here, and it's fundamentally important.
Maybe we'll leave it at that, and I'll just maybe tack on an observation about the conversation that's spanned over the last 40 minutes or so, is that we're not trying to scare or frighten anybody into paralysis. We're saying that the maintenance on the building is overdue. And if we continue to ignore it, maintenance ignored, it eventually will be a catastrophic teardown. And that is hugely expensive. So time is not on our side, but we still have time to think long-term, to think professional, put the client first. And if we do that right, I am an optimist, not a hopeless one, but an optimist. I think we do have time to get this fixed.
I agree with your very neat summary.
Tim, we don't often do this on this podcast, but the work you put out is so very good. You're a non-for-profit at its core, even though you're funded by WTW, an organization I have tremendous respect for. What is the website? Maybe some things are behind a paywall. I'm not even sure about that, but there is a lot of valuable research the viewer can get.
Yes, we try and put increasing amounts into the public domain, but the members who support us financially have some stuff behind a login. but thinkingaheadinstitute.org, I think, is the correct email address. I haven't had to type it in for a long time. It just comes up automatically for me.
Okay, excellent. Well, a Google search, or I guess ChatGPT, if it doesn't hallucinate, will get you there. So, Tim, great conversation. Thanks for the partnership and your contributions. And together, I think we're going to lead this industry, hopefully more of a profession, in a better place.
Really appreciate your support, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Educational Alpha. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Learn more about the CAIA Association and subscribe to the show at CAIA.org. That's CAIA.org. See you next time.